Hello everyone, welcome to the presentation. I am Lori and my teammates are Lacey, Mode, and Logan. As for today, the presentation is mostly about food. My subtopic is banquets, what types of food there are, and also what the everyday life of the banquets was for the people. First of all, what is a banquet? A banquet is used for big celebrations and for high officials and or upper class to show off wealth and also to keep social order within the organizations that they have or community. It reinforces the connections on a political base. These banquets have thousands of people or sometimes can be more intimate for smaller gatherings, although most people did like to show off their wealth by having these banquets. As seen in the picture, these banquets did have a larger room, but it was also considered a smaller room for most. In the other pictures, we do see examples of what the high officials could lay on to enjoy the food that they had. There's also another picture posting of what entertainment and also what other foods and who was serving the higher officials, the upper class. In these banquets, there was also often arguments happening in the moment, though there was also singing happening, so it was either overshadowed or also overheard. In the next pictures, we also see how the spread of Romans and Greek was super different, comparing that most of them had a meat diet or also had a vegetable diet. Most of these foods that were consumed were within ceramic containers or vases, although they did also drink from these ceramic vases since there was a high quality of wine within them. As we see within this picture, the food in ancient Greece. Greece was known to have set meals for set days, although they did have the wine, which was mentioned before, high quality, but it was also used to enjoy during the day, which did lead to brawls and also a lot of fighting within the week. That was it for what food was at banquets, higher class, and for lower class.
Roman food, especially amongst the wealthy population, was another domain in which they excelled in, creating all sorts of dishes from both familiar and exotic ingredients. Food is often a way to express one's culture. For example, cena was the main meal amongst the Roman people and the most consistent meal. And before going to bed, more of the wealthier households and people enjoyed a light meal called vesperna. But as the Roman population became larger and more prosperous, the more exotic and varied the menu became for the wealthier people. They ate things like exotic meats, garum, finer bread and pastries, and finally had access to imported spices and herbs. For the working class, meals were organized around the working day so that there was an extra meal. The prandium, which was a midday meal before cena, that could temper the workers' hunger. On the other hand, the Roman upper class managed all their affairs in the morning so that they could enjoy cena starting around 2 p.m. After first visiting the baths, cena would often be accompanied in the evening by commensation or the drinking of alcohol like wine and a certain kind of beer. And wealthy Romans often had their wine flavored with honey, as honey was a valuable and prized commodity in ancient Rome. As well as being a public figure or wealthy was essential in maintaining status and influence. The Roman elites operated within highly established structures of patronage and clientship. Impressing one's network could make or break a political career. Some ancient Romans ran up huge debts on expensive wines and foods on entertaining others. This was not as crazy as it sounds because entertainment built political capital. And having expensive foods for the wealthier people was essential in upstanding their social status. So by having expensive foods to meet their other more well-off associates' expectations, and having these foods was an essential not only for themselves as wealthy figures, but to make sure the expenses in which they took for the food were known.
Now we'll be moving along with the topic of what poor people ate back in the day in ancient Rome and Greece. So, in one of the videos that I found, which is called The Everyday Life of the Ancient Greeks, which includes housing, clothing, and food by the Echoes of the Ancient World channel. So, for breakfast, normally what poor people would eat would be dry bread with either water or goat milk. For lunch, they would have barley flatbreads with goat or sheep cheese and a few olives. For dinner, it would be barley, porridge, vegetables, and fish. Concerning any dairy products, it was very rare, so it was eaten only on special occasions, usually sheep, goats, or any other cattle. The way they would eat meat would be in the form of sausages or offal. So the people that cooked were often women and children. Overall, poor people, their food choices were limited. An encyclopedia called Ancient Greece and Rome by Carol Moulton talks about how famine affected people of Rome. Because of war, there was a lot of malnutrition, so what they ate was barley, chestnuts to make bread, herbs, and weeds, which were their last resort. And a lot of people would just commit suicide because the famine was so heavy on them. But this encyclopedia also mentions how even in better times, when there was no war, there was still a lot of famine. In another article called The Hunger and Sword, Warfare and Food Supply in Roman Republican Wars, which happened between 264 to 30 BC, by Paul Erdkamp, mostly talks about how during war times, their enemies would often steal, destroy crops, and population was going down, which essentially led to poverty, lack of food, and other things as such. And in Erdkamp's second article, he talks about how in the Gallic War, Caesar would use servants to provide food for the armies, although there was a huge lack of food supply, so the armies didn't necessarily eat enough and were often deprived from food and water.
So moving on to the last subtopic of today's presentation on food, I'm going to be focusing on the religious foods. So therefore, I'm going to be focusing on wine and how it was celebrated, as well as sacred foods, sacred cakes, and unburnt offerings in ancient Greece. So to begin with wine, it was very symbolic for both the Greeks and the Romans. There were 3 kinds of wine, so there was rough wine, sweet wine, and thin wine, and they each came with their own unique aspects. So for example, thin wine was very rich and dry and only became worthy of drinking after 25 years. The importance of wine to the Romans was immense. It was crucial that their drink could not be polluted, so water was often avoided. However, it allowed the Romans to have a drink that could be stored more easily than beer, as well as give them enjoyment and still be inexpensive. As for the religious aspects of wine, it all comes down to the worship of Dionysus, the god of wine, theater, and festivity. The cult of this god was important for the Greek religion, and by the 6th century BCE, the Dionysia festival was established in Athens. So moving on now to sacred foods from ancient Greece. Sacred cakes in ancient Greeks were baked loaves, biscuits, pastries, and sponges sweetened with honey and prepared as unburnt offerings to the gods, goddesses, and other divine beings. The cakes could be made from different sorts of wheat or barley flours, combined with additional ingredients including cheese, herbs, fruits, sesame seeds, and filled or decorated with fruits and nuts. Greek sacred cakes were offered to the gods and goddesses, or even to the kings and heroes commemorated and immortalized as city founders, saviors, and/or ancestors. These gifts were used in both private and public sacred rituals, where they were carried in ceremonial processions by people who were specially selected for this role. Bringing sacred cakes or clay models to a shrine or temple was also common in daily prayers or thanksgiving. Food offerings were served to the worshippers, both clergy and lay, who sat down to eat together as a sign of belonging to the same fellowship, to strengthen their sense of unification and companionship, and to integrate with the worshipped deity through eating the cake or bread, which symbolized his or her material incarnation. Although the ritual practice of developing an inner connection with a deity through eating symbolic pieces of their body does not start with the Greek in ancient history, its adoption by later religions such as Christianity is a visible effect of the Greek cultural influence in the Roman Empire and beyond. And lastly, before making the cake, a clay model was made and presented as a way of demonstrating the stages of the baking process. the baking, as well as the clay models were made by women, as it was believed that kitchen duties were a woman's job. And that is all for today's presentation. Hope you guys enjoyed and that you now know more about religious foods.